Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I've read that is a part of the monthly book club that I'm a part of. If you want to join it, make sure to comment below or join our Discord, and shout out to my friend Bevan, of course. And today's book is all about men and women in horror movies. I am referring to Men, Women, and Chainsaws by Carol Clover, which was published in 1992. Yes, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, the three genders. But for those who don't know, Carol Clover is an American academic professor. She is mostly known for writing about medieval literature. She has 3 books published to her names and a handful of journal articles, and 2 of those books are about medieval literature or something like that. And then there's just this, which is about horror movies and trends in movies in general, which she has written a couple of journal articles about, but it doesn't seem to be her main focus. What's really interesting is that Carol Clover is credited with coming up, well, maybe not generating, but writing about the idea of the final girl in horror movies. Often the woman who is remaining against the nefarious horror movie foe that she has to face. And it's at least as far as I recall, there might be people who don't know, but horror, in general, horror movie fans always talk about the final girl. So for her to kind of create that and become the foundation for literature is pretty significant. And she hasn't really done much else, and writing isn't her main focus. She's not writing nonfiction for the fun of it. It seems to be it's part of her academic career. So kind of an unusual bit in that I wouldn't normally talk about an author like this, but this is book club, and it's also one of those diversity, social justice kind of reads that gets me to experience something that I might not normally have read about. And so without further ado, let's talk about Men, Women, and Chainsaws. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Men, Women, and Chainsaws, as I mentioned earlier, focuses on men and women in horror movies, specifically women, and what horror movies mean for gender studies and whatnot. This is a bit of an academic kind of book, but her introduction focuses on Carrie, noting how Carrie is both the victim as well as the horror movie villain in the movie Carrie, and how that's it's very interesting that we get that perspective that doesn't really happen in other types of movies. Clover goes on to talk about the male gaze and how we're often given this perspective of the male in horror movies, since we see so much from the villain's perspective, who is most likely a male figure, and so we get to sort of experience that perspective of being the killer for a little bit before we ultimately move on to the woman who in the last part of the movie saves the day or something like that, and she carefully examines more about women's roles, how they're often the victims in the story, and how that says a lot for how society views women at large. She goes on to talk about slasher films as well, noting how, again, women are the victims in those movies, and they're often just made in cannon fodder. She notes how Psycho had 1 killing in it, but subsequent horror movies just killed tons and tons of women, and that's pretty strange, but it's par for the course for what horror is. And she notes horror movies do seem to value women, in that there is the idea of the final girl, the last remaining survivor of this horror massacre that takes place in so many movies like Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream, Barbarian, and so many other horror movies. And what's interesting is that although the final girl is a woman, she's often masculinized. The woman has to take on male qualities and ultimately use a phallic-like symbol to stab the main villain of the story. And it seems to be the opposite for men, as she's noting that many of these horror villains dress in drag, or dress in large clothing that isn't typically masculine. Clover might be arguing at one point that she thinks that this is largely to do with our desire to experience life as a woman, to sort of experience that perspective, and we're allowed to live that out in the form of a slasher. Often, like Psycho, that's a good example because Norman Bates dressed as his mother in that movie. She also goes on to talk about occult films and how they slightly differed from slashers because they're more focused on the supernatural, and noting particularly how women are the victims in those movies because they are often the victims of the possessing by the demons or the ghost that takes place within it. So women are very lucky and often die in those movies, whereas males often deal with that possession and seeing the horror of it happen, but also they deal with a central conflict. The movie is more about them, even though the women are suffering. A good example she refers to is the Exorcist, where the Reagan is the one being possessed by the demon, but the male protagonist of the movie is dealing with his loss of faith in God and how he realizes that faith again through Reagan and the demon possession. Clover also goes on to talk about exploitation movies, like I Spit on Your Grave, which isn't specifically a horror movie, but does share some elements with horror. And I Spit on Your Grave is that movie about a woman who is raped when she goes on vacation, and so she takes out her anger and frustrations on the four men who raped her. And it's a pretty violent movie, which a lot of people have said is sort of glorifies rape. But Clover, and even I would argue that it doesn't. That it's actually more focused on rape revenge and a little bit on empowerment. But in order to empower the woman, you have to bring her down first, which is unfortunate. And she also goes on to compare this against the movie Deliverance, which is another sort of rape revenge fantasy film. And she talks about how these are representative of urban noia, specifically noting that the city fears the country and what those country folk can do to them. And so we often come to the country in movies and kill a whole bunch of people before they can do that to us. And she also goes on to talk about a movie called The Accused, which is another sort of rape revenge kind of thing where a person goes to court and wins the case against their rapist. And she notes that The Accused really highlights the fantasy that exists there of getting revenge, of getting justice against your attacker, against your rapist. But it does so through the lens of the legal system, whereas I Spit on Your Grave does it extrajudicially. And they're very similar in that regard. And I think she also says that she argues that The Accused is a bit naive and that it thinks that the justice system can handle all these cases, or that it fairly handles it, and that justice can truly be won in those situations. And then she also goes on to talk about like Peeping Toms and voyeurism, specifically noting a movie like Peeping Tom, where a cameraman kills the people that he's photographing as he's photographing them, and how that movie makes the audience spectators and gives them a hand in that role, making them feel uncomfortable, and also allowing them to live out some weird secret fantasies about assault on women. And although those movies that isn't the focus, that does play into some sort of psychology there. She goes on to talk about Freud and sadism and masochism. Again, those aren't the central focus of horror movies, but it does play to something in our minds that allows us to live out these voyeuristic, somewhat sadist fantasies that we have towards women or towards men. And fully examining that will help us better understand the ultimate relationship between men and women in society, and that's about where her writing ends. In terms of analysis, there is a little bit worth talking, a fair amount worth talking about here. I don't want to go into too much detail because her writing is essentially analysis itself, and so I'd be analyzing analysis and just really arguing with her. I only want to point out a couple different things that are of note, specifically that of the final girl, and how like in horror movies, horror seems to both support but also masculinize women. Like there's an idea that like, hey, women are great and they can stand up for themselves, but they also have to develop masculine qualities in order to be able to do that. Like a great example is in the Friday the 13th movies, where ultimately the final girl has to stab Jason. And take on these masculine qualities, and also use the phallic objects in order to get one over on Jason. And in some cases, it's very overt in that they have to pretend to be Jason's mother in order to distract him a little bit. So if they're not taking on masculine qualities, they're assuming the role of a maternal figure, which is very interesting in that it seems that there are very limited roles for women in horror movies. And so, yeah, the final girl can stand up to herself, but she has to take on those masculine roles. And for the masculine villain in those cases, the villain has to be feminized in some way. It's not enough to simply defeat the villain on their terms. You have to demasculate them and like give them feminine qualities, like in the way that they're executed, like a knife through the mouth or something like that to represent the phallic objects. I'm saying phallic a little too much in this review, but that's the nature of this book. And it really makes me wonder, like, is this intentional, or do horror movie directors have bad opinion of women, or are we looking into this a little too deeply and that's not all there? And I do think maybe it's an element of all three, that maybe there is some misogyny in horror movies, but I do think that to some extent there's also like this is reaching, that maybe not all of this is there, but there is something there for you to be able to point out there's a final girl and she behaves this certain way, and that applies to so many horror movies. That's noticing something about the stories that we tell that stands out, and we should actually ask why we're telling that kind of story. So the idea of the final girl is just fascinating in general, because like it's always a woman who stands alone at the end. I can't recall the last time I saw a horror movie where the man was sort of the hero at the end of it, besides The Evil Dead, but that movie with Sam Raimi. It seems like the only person alive in that series is Ash Williams. But you could argue that he's kind of demasculated over the series of the movie, which is something else worth talking about. And you could also argue like Drag Me to Hell, that movie with Justin Long and another woman actress whose name I don't know, but I'll put up here. Like, she's dragged to hell at the end of the movie, and Justin Long is left to watch. But you could argue that maybe Justin Long has been demasculated or something like that. I don't know. There's a lot worth discussing, and it deserves a larger sort of person to go through all the horror movies that might have come out in various time periods and examine it further. But this does bring up an important question. Why do we watch horror movies? What attracts us to horror movies? Because it's kind of like antithetical to why we want to be entertained, or why we go out to be entertained. Because we want to feel good about things, but if we go see a horror movie, we're going to be on edge for an hour, 2 hours, something like that. And it never really makes sense why we do that, but I'm one of the people who goes and does that. And I don't really fully understand why I love to see horror movies. But there's an explanation by Clover, and then there's also, I think, some other good reasons that I don't think she fully grasps. But she argues that it could be like a voyeuristic escape. Like, we have these sadist and masochistic kind of beliefs in our minds, sort of desires that we can't fully give into, we can't say out loud, because society would frown upon that. And like horror movies allow us to dig in and realize that without people getting hurt in any sort of way. It allows us to indulge and have like a moment or two of joy in that regard. And it could be psychosexual, which he notes Freud in this, so that could be very well what she's getting at. And then like the question is, well, if we feel that way, why are we repulsed by horror movies? Why do we stand up and say, hey, that's not good, that movie went a little too far with its horror? And I think some of the times that might have to do, as she notes, with the fact that once we realize our impulses, we become a little bit disgusted, that we realize, oh, we wanted to see that. We were happy about this sort of thing in a horror movie, and so we get a little upset with ourselves. We don't like that realization about who we are, and so we try to shove it back down again. So in that way, I can kind of see that, but I also think that's a little too easy of an answer. It's very Freudian, and Freud, for as many contributions as he had to psychology, I feel like his research isn't that heavily backed up. The psychoanalytical method, like while it can be helpful in therapy, it doesn't provide all the answers. I think to lean on Freud here and to just say, oh, it's because we're all sadist or masochist in our own minds is a little too easy, and like it hides the real reasons that we might go see horror movies. And one of those reasons I think, as Clover gets at in this book, is that we might see ourselves in these extreme struggling characters, as is the case with every single movie, but especially horror movies, because that it's mostly about struggle. You have the character of Carrie, who she mentions here, who is dealing with a lot of school bullying, who is dealing with a lot with religious parents who don't want to help her, and she's at a very weird point in her life. And sure, not everyone who watches this is going to be a telepath who's on the verge of destroying their entire school, but they might sympathize with these things that Carrie is going through and be like, I see myself in this person. I really like this movie. And that can apply to a lot of different horror movies, especially with vampires or ghosts or something like that. I think Anne Rice was kind of ahead of the curve on that when she made vampires sexy and people wanted to have sex with vampires, because people are, especially because it's made for teenagers, and teenagers are at a point where they're like feeling those weird emotions that maybe they shouldn't, or like that are forbidden for them to feel, and so to feel those against vampires is something else entirely. But I do think that we see ourselves in these characters. Maybe not always in the villains, maybe more so in the protagonists, but to be isolated and lonely in society is something that we feel a connection to. And then I also think that horror, as Clover notes, she only touches upon it a little bit. Like, horror appeals to people on the margins of society. For a lot of horror movies, they're shown in art houses, especially in the 70s and 80s, in the time of exploitation. Like, not all horror movies got mainstream releases, and so the people on the margins of society who went and saw movies in those theaters would come out of them and feel a deeper connection to horror, because they felt seen in that regard. And a lot of good horror actually, dives deep into that marginalization and seeks to understand it a little bit more, and trying to figure out more about why we treat people a certain way or something like that. A good example of this is Get Out, which is about a black man who is getting, or like we eventually find out that he's his identity is going to be stolen by a bunch of white people, and it's I encourage you to go see it. It's Jordan Peele's movie. It's really good, but it gets at to the marginalization of black individuals and white liberalism and its many problems. But horror appeals to those people. Like, it tells a story that maybe the people on the margins might want to be told, and not many other genres do that, because action appeals to more mainstream audiences, and rom-coms aren't really interested in challenging their viewers. So horror does something that maybe the other genres don't try to do, and I think that's a lot of the reason why we seek out horror. If you have another good explanation, let me know in the comments below. This would be a great opportunity for discussion here. I also think that Clover does a really good examination of rape in movies, specifically noting rape revenge and how the justice system doesn't always help those who are trying to get justice for rape. Also noting the weird sort of trend of rape in horror movies, but also rape in exploitation films in general. And you might argue that we don't see that these days, but I still think that there's a lot of instances of unnecessary rape scenes in movies, or just general rape scenes in movies that maybe don't need to be there. A good example is the Game of Thrones series, where that happens quite frequently, and her explanation goes into a lot of detail that I don't have time to go into here, but I do think if you want more perspective on that, or you want to see it in a different way that you might not have done before, this might be a good book to check out for you. Of course, there is just a couple problems that I have with this. It does feel a little too academic. It's 200 and so pages, and a lot of it deals with gender studies and film, and a lot of heavy sort of field-specific terminology that the layperson might not understand. I feel like Carol Clover wrote this for an academic audience instead of a widespread audience, so that can make it hard to get into. And I do think that she also does too much of a focus on Freud. She is studying like the psychological implications of all of this, but she doesn't. But she leans too much on Freud and not many of the researchers who came after, and might have different perspectives on the matter of sex and women in the world. So I do think it could have benefited from more of a sociological or a different psychological kind of lens of which she was studying. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Men, Women, and Chainsaws by Carol Clover. A pretty solid book, one that certainly educated me a little bit more about men and women in horror movies. I would like to see an updated version of this for for some of the more modern horror movies, especially stuff like Barbarian, Life After Beth, It Follows, which definitely there's definitely an explanation of sex and gender in those movies, and I think it'd be really worth seeing if that aligns with what Clover has been saying, or if horror movies have been shaken up a little bit. It'd be worth reading there. As I noted, like, this is really good, but it might be hard to get into, so it's not for everyone. I do recommend it, but I have a feeling that a lot of people might get bored by it really easily, or just be too sort of out of it. Like, they might not really understand what's going on, and it might just sink it for them. So just be aware of that as if you're going to go out and read it. Comment below if you have any thoughts, as per usual. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Potentially join the Discord if you want to talk about this book, and join book club, or just be a part of the Discord and have chats about whatever's going on in the world. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and horror movie travels. Farewell.